You and I describe people all the time, right? We say they're honest, or creative, or shy, or energetic. But how do you take those everyday words and turn them into a real, actual science of personality? That's the big question we're tackling today.
For the longest time, psychology was full of these really fascinating ideas from thinkers like Freud and Jung, but they were pretty much impossible to measure. As the psychologist Raymond Cattell bluntly put it, from a scientific point of view, their work was a disaster. Why? Because for him, science is, first and foremost, all about measurement.
And you can really see this huge shift in thinking right here. The old way, psychoanalysis, it was all about diving deep into the unconscious mind, stuff you can't really see or prove. But this new approach, trait theory, came along with a simple yet totally revolutionary idea. Let's just focus on the consistent, observable patterns in how people act, think, and feel. The new rule was simple. If you can't measure it, it isn't science.
So if you're going to build the science of personality from scratch, where to even begin? Well, our story kicks off with a man who had a wild idea. Let's start by collecting all the words.
Meet Gordon Allport. He looked at psychoanalysis and thought it was way too deep and untestable. But he also thought other approaches were too shallow. So he came up with this brilliant idea. What if the basic building blocks of personality are hidden in plain sight, right there in the language we use every single day?
And let me tell you, he went for it. Allport and his team literally went through the entire English dictionary. We're talking over 150,000 words, and they pulled out every single term that could possibly be used to describe a person. This whole thing was called the lexical approach, and it boiled that huge list down to about 4,500 adjectives. I mean, can you imagine? It was a mountain of data. He sorted them into 3 levels. At the very top, you have these super rare cardinal traits that just dominate a person's entire life. Think of Scrooge and his greed. Then you've got the general traits, which are the basic building blocks for most of us. Things like honesty or kindness. And finally, there are secondary traits, the ones that only show up in certain situations, like getting anxious before a public speech. Okay, so Allport gathered all the raw material, which is amazing. But 4,500 traits? That's still way too messy to be a useful map of personality. So the next pioneer's job was to figure out how to sort that mountain and find the hidden structure inside. And that's where Raymond Cattell comes in. They nicknamed him the Squirrel because he was just obsessed with gathering and sorting data. He took one look at Allport's giant list and thought, there has to be a better way to organize this. And that was the million-dollar question. How on earth do you take thousands of descriptive words and shrink them down into a manageable scientific map? You can't just guess. You need a seriously powerful tool. And that tool was called factor analysis. Now, don't let the name scare you. It's basically a statistical technique that acts like a superpowered pattern finder. It's designed to find which traits tend to cluster or hang out together.
Let's break it down real simple. First, you get a ton of data on which traits people have. Then, the computer program gets to work, finding which words are highly connected. For instance, it might notice that people who are described as honest are also very likely to be described as loyal and sincere. Factor analysis then groups those words together, and the researcher can say, aha, this cluster represents one single underlying thing, and they call that a factor. So, Cattell took Allport's huge list of 4,500 traits and fed it into his brand new factor analysis machine. So what number popped out on the other side? Not 1,000, not 100, but this one, 16. Cattell was convinced he'd found the fundamental elements of personality. Just like chemistry has the periodic table of elements, he believed these 16 personality factors, or 16 PF, were the basic building blocks that combine in different ways to make each and every one of us unique. This was a massive leap forward. But hold on, the story doesn't end there. Our final pioneer, a guy named Eysenck, looked at Cattell's 16 factors and started wondering, could this map be even simpler? And could we trace it all the way back to our biology? So here's Eysenck. Let's call him the Owl. He was known for these theories that looked really simple on the outside, but were incredibly deep underneath. And he had a hunch that even Cattell's 16 factors weren't the most fundamental level of personality. His idea was kind of genius in its simplicity. He thought, hey, if factor analysis can group traits into factors, what would happen if we used it on the factors themselves? He was looking for an even higher level of organization, what he called superfactors. And that's exactly what he did. Eysenck's model boiled all of personality down to just 3 huge independent dimensions: extroversion, neuroticism, and a third, kind of controversial one, he called psychoticism. This became famous as the PEN model. From thousands of words down to 16, now down to just 3. But Eysenck didn't stop there. He wanted to know why. He argued these traits had a real biological basis. For extroversion, he said it's all about brain arousal. His theory was that introverts naturally have a higher level of brain activity, so they try to avoid intense stuff like loud parties. Extroverts, on the other hand, have lower baseline arousal, so they're always seeking out excitement to get their brains to that just right level. So what about neuroticism? Well, he connected that to our built-in fear and stress response. He theorized that people who are high in neuroticism have a nervous system that's just more reactive, and maybe an overactive amygdala. That's the brain's fear center.
This makes them biologically wired to feel more anxious, jumpy, and stressed out.
So think about that journey, from thousands of words to 16 factors, all the way down to just 3 biological dimensions. It's a pretty incredible story of scientific simplification. But the question is, did Eysenck finally complete the map?
Well, not quite. Some cracks started to appear in his theory. A lot of psychologists felt that 3 factors just wasn't enough to capture how rich and complex personality really is. I mean, think about it. Where does a super important trait like conscientiousness, being hardworking and organized, where does that fit in? It doesn't. Not really. And on top of that, the biological evidence for his third factor, psychoticism, was always pretty shaky. So here's the bottom line. These pioneers, Allport, Cattell, and Eysenck, they did the really hard, groundbreaking work. They turned the study of personality into a real science. You could say they mapped the first great continents of who we are. But their work left this huge, tantalizing question hanging in the air. What if the map still isn't finished? What else might be out there just waiting to be discovered?